The Harland estate stood at the edge of the village like a monument to order. Its windows reflected the gray skies without ever revealing what lay inside, and its tall chimneys released only the faintest trails of smoke, as if the house itself refused to breathe too deeply. People called it respectable, even noble, because the Harlands had given wages to miners and kept coal flowing when other lords let their pits collapse. Yet no one in the village could say they had ever felt welcome within its walls. Invitations never came. Conversations with the family were short, polite, and always at a distance, as though each word was weighed before it left their mouths. The Harlands lived by rules that were never spoken aloud, rules that shaped the house into something more than stone and timber. Silence was their greatest inheritance, carried through generations like a sacred law. Laughter never spilled from its windows, not even during weddings or christenings. Children were raised to move gently across the polished floors, to speak in tones that could not be heard beyond the nearest wall. Even servants said that the house taught them to step lighter, to let doors close without a sound, to let their own breath vanish in its corridors. The wealth that built this silence came from coal pulled out of the ground by men who coughed black into their pillows until their ribs cracked. The miners gave their strength, their lives, their lungs, and in return the Harlands offered wages just high enough to keep families loyal. The village understood that debt, but it could never question it. The Harlands paid for the church roof, for the poorhouse repairs, for the school. The villagers told themselves this was kindness, but in truth it was a chain. Gratitude bound them tighter than fear. Inside the estate, the air never changed. Even in summer, the rooms were cold, lined with portraits of ancestors who stared with eyes too alive for canvas. These portraits were hung low so that each visitor, even the servants, felt their gaze follow them as they worked. The family silver was polished so often that the faces of those who passed could be seen warped upon its surface. The pewter goblets carried a faint taste of iron, and the plates shone with the same dull glow as the coal that bought them. Every object seemed preserved, never aging, never bending to time. Yet beneath the neat lines of wealth and respectability, something darker had settled, something no one dared to name. Strange accidents had followed the Harland name for decades: an infant who never cried and was found cold in its cradle, a maid who fell from a second-story window though no one heard her scream, a gardener who vanished leaving his tools half buried in the soil. These events were spoken of in hushed tones and always explained away as tragedy or misfortune, but in the village memory they were stitched together, forming a pattern no one dared to describe aloud. The house itself seemed to protect these secrets. Doors locked themselves without keys. Lamps sputtered out when the wrong words were spoken. At night, the chimneys breathed a heavy odor that mixed coal smoke with something sharper, something closer to burning flesh. The servants noticed but said nothing. To work for the Harlands was to be paid on time, and to be paid was to survive. Silence kept families fed. Silence kept the estate alive. Beneath the stone floors, deeper than the coal cellars, ran passages that no servant entered. They were said to be filled with damp air and lined with walls that glistened as though oiled. No one could confirm it, yet everyone believed it. Children dared one another to press an ear to the locked grates, claiming they heard faint sounds rising through the cracks. The tick of metal, the scratch of something sharp, or the faint tremor of a breath taken where no one should live. The Harlands never spoke of such things. Their dinners remained quiet, their gifts to the church continued, their faces never betrayed anything but calm restraint. To stand before them was to see order made flesh, but to step inside their house was to feel a pressure beneath the skin, as if something watched from the corners of every corridor. Outwardly refined, inwardly rotten, The Harland estate carried the weight of generations that had built their empire not only on coal, but on silence that devoured all protest, all memory, and all cries for help. And within that silence, something waited to be named. Elias Harland carried himself with a grace that drew no suspicion. He was the sort of man neighbors pointed to as an example of civility, the kind of heir who smiled gently when passing on the lane, who bowed his head in church with quiet humility, who wore gloves not to boast but to signal neatness and restraint. His voice never rose above a soft murmur. His movements were careful, measured, as though he had practiced the art of appearing harmless. In the village, they spoke of his patience with children, how he allowed them to touch his polished shoes or tug at his coat without rebuke. Mothers trusted him to lead Sunday lessons, and fathers admired the order he represented. No one questioned that order because no one wished to look beneath its surface. Yet Elias was a man built upon two layers. The first was what others saw: generosity, routine, charm. The second, hidden and silent, was where his true inheritance lived. Within his rooms at the Harland estate, he kept journals bound in dark leather, their pages filled with writings that could not be mistaken for innocent study. These journals were not the notes of a doctor nor the sketches of an artist. They were diagrams of human anatomy rendered with an obsessive hand, accompanied by formulas that twisted science into something colder. The heart was not drawn as an organ to heal, but as a mechanism to be stopped and restarted at will. The lungs were charted not for breath, but for the way breath could be denied, rationed, or inverted. Every part of the body was studied not for its natural function, but for its possible reversal. Elias approached his writings as if they were holy scripture. He numbered his experiments, catalogued them, revised them. He wrote of unmaking with the same reverence priests gave to creation. Where others saw skin and blood, Elias saw doors that could be turned backward, hinges that could be forced to open the wrong way. He believed the body contained not only life but a secret code for silence. And if silence could be mastered, then death itself could be shaped into something more than an end. By day he lived as a neighbor, hosting teas where he served cakes dusted with sugar and spoke of crops, weather, and sermons. He laughed when appropriate, nodded when expected, and kept his gloves spotless. No guest could have guessed that beneath his calm exterior he was studying them the way a butcher studies livestock. Their movements, their smiles, the way they chewed, the pulse at their throat. He noted all of it, though never on paper while they watched. He would write later, in the solitude of his room, recording each detail like an entry in a ledger. At church he knelt with the faithful, eyes closed, hands folded in perfect mimicry of devotion. When the priest spoke of salvation, Elias measured the cadence of the man's breathing. When children sang hymns, Elias traced in his mind how their voices strained against small lungs. He prayed not to God, but to his own theory of control. And when he opened his eyes, the congregation saw only humility. They never saw the calculations flickering behind his calm gaze. The gloves Elias wore became his emblem. They were always white, always immaculate, and he never removed them in public. Neighbors said it was a sign of refinement, but in truth the gloves hid the faint stains that no amount of scrubbing could erase. Beneath the fabric, his hands bore tiny nicks and burns, marks from instruments and chemicals he had tested. His skin carried the record of every experiment, though no one was allowed to see it. The gloves allowed him to present himself as untouched, unmarked, innocent. The journals, however, betrayed what he truly was. In their pages he recorded fantasies of inverting life, eyes trained not to see outward but forced inward, ears sealed with wax so that only the echo of one's own heartbeat remained, tongues split and sewn to silence a scream before it was born. He devised contraptions in careful sketches, Boxes that turned breath into liquid, chairs that measured the exact point where blood ceased to circulate. Each idea was presented with neat handwriting, as though cruelty became less monstrous when wrapped in order. The Harland estate held these journals in locked drawers, but Elias always kept one volume close, hidden beneath his coat when he walked. To others it looked like a prayer book. He carried it to the fields, to the church, to the village square, writing observations that would feed his growing archive. He lived two lives seamlessly, his mask and his truth never colliding. To the world he was the heir in white gloves, patient, kind, dependable. In private he was an architect of silence, planning not for life's continuation but for its reversal. The line between those lives blurred with each passing year, and soon the estate itself would bear witness to the first signs of what Elias's journals demanded. What began as sketches and formulas would need flesh and bone to prove them. The mask of kindness would hold, but beneath it the hunger had already begun. The first disappearance unfolded quietly, as though the house itself had planned it long before Elias made his move. The maid was young, with hands roughened by scrubbing stone floors and carrying coal scuttles. Her face remembered in the village only as kind but ordinary. She came to the Harland estate with no family close enough to ask questions that might echo too loudly. When she vanished, the villagers whispered of runaway romance, of debts left unpaid, of sickness that drove her to hide. Such stories were easier to believe than the truth that settled behind the locked doors of the estate. Elias had chosen her with the same patience he gave to every decision. He studied her habits in silence, the way her eyes darted nervously when others raised their voices, the way she paused to listen to the clocks that ticked in nearly every room, the way her footsteps echoed faintly even when she tried to move unnoticed. He saw not a servant but an opportunity, a body that could be mapped against his theories of silence. For weeks he noted her movements, recording each detail in his leather-bound journal. When the time came, he acted with the calm precision of a man completing a task already rehearsed in his mind. The Harlands were known for their generosity, so when the maid failed to appear for work one morning, Elias himself encouraged the talk of concern. He offered coins for the search, speaking in tones of sorrow that convinced the villagers of his kindness. Posters were printed, search parties walked the fields, and the church bells rang for her safe return. No one suspected that beneath their feet, inside the estate's hidden chamber, she was still alive, waiting for the conclusion of an experiment Elias called the Trial of Silence. The chamber lay beneath the old wine cellar, behind a false wall that no servant had ever seen breached. Inside, the air was damp, the stone close enough to touch with both hands spread. Elias had prepared the space with care, lining the walls with shelves of instruments and notebooks. A single chair sat at the center, bolted to the floor, its arms fitted with iron clasps. Against one wall stood a heavy grandfather clock, its pendulum swinging with relentless precision. The chamber smelled of iron and damp wood, a scent Elias welcomed, for it reminded him of permanence. When the maid awoke in that room, Elias greeted her with the same gentle voice he used in church. He explained nothing of cruelty, only the importance of silence. He told her that the human body betrayed itself through sound, that the tongue and the breath were disobedient organs, and that he intended to measure the moment they could be subdued. His tone carried no hatred, no passion, only the weight of calm conviction. Then, with hands steady inside his white gloves, he threaded fine cord through her tongue, binding it tightly until even the faintest attempt at a cry collapsed into muffled pain. The experiment began with the clock. Elias marked each second on his parchment, watching how her body trembled against the chair, how her chest heaved in irregular bursts, how her eyes darted wildly in search of escape. He did not measure screams, for none were possible. Instead, he measured tremors, the silent quakes of a body deprived of its natural voice. Each movement was catalogued, each twitch reduced to a number aligned against the beat of the pendulum. In his mind, she was not a woman, but a living equation, her body a formula proving his theories of reversal. As hours stretched into days, Elias allowed only enough water to keep her alive, recording how thirst deepened the silence within her. He timed the moment when her sobs no longer shook her shoulders, when her eyes ceased to plead and instead stared blankly at the swaying pendulum. He believed he was not extinguishing life, but teaching it obedience. To him, her silence was not death, but a perfected state, a surrender to the law he had always worshipped. When the maid's body finally slumped against the restraints, Elias recorded the exact second, marking it beside the steady tick of the clock. He did not speak of death. He wrote instead of completion. The body was carried through the hidden passages and disposed of in a pit lined with coal ash, indistinguishable from the refuse of the mines. By the time the villagers lit candles for her in the church, nothing of her remained but numbers written in his journal. Elias returned to daily life as though nothing had changed. He bowed in the pews, poured tea for his neighbors, and spoke gently to children who tugged at his coat. The Harlands increased their donation to the search fund, ensuring their reputation remained untarnished. And beneath the house, behind the false wall, the grandfather clock continued to tick, marking the beginning of a legacy of silence that had only just begun. The maid's disappearance left a faint shadow on the Harland estate, yet the family's generosity and Elias's calm composure convinced the village to look elsewhere for answers. They whispered in corners about misfortune, about servants who left in secret, about women who followed fleeting promises. But no one accused the Harlands. Wealth cast a shield too heavy to pierce. Elias understood this perfectly. Silence was not only a condition he studied, but also a weapon he wielded, and the world around him played its part without even knowing it. As the weeks passed, his journals filled with entries on tremors, time, and the stillness that overcame the body when the voice was stripped away. But to Elias, the experiment had only scratched the surface. He longed not only to hear silence, but to see it, to watch how identity itself could break apart when confronted with its own undoing. He began sketching plans for a new chamber, one that would turn the human form into an endless reflection of itself until even recognition collapsed. In the hidden passages beneath the estate, he constructed what he called the mirror box. It was built like a coffin, narrow and suffocating, its interior lined with polished mirrors framed in copper sheets. Every surface reflected back the figure within, multiplying faces and limbs into a prison of infinite selves. The copper seams ensured no light escaped, trapping the victim in an endless hall of their own image. Elias designed it so the box could be sealed tight, and at its base he fixed a small chamber connected to thin pipes that carried a slow, deliberate stream of acid. It was not meant to kill quickly. It was meant to transform. The first subject placed inside was chosen with the same cold calculation as before. Elias knew how to appear sympathetic when a villager spoke of hardship, how to offer charity in the daylight even as he marked potential victims in his mind. The chosen one entered the box, trembling, eyes darting as the lid closed and the world shrank to a tight chamber of glass and copper. Inside, every flinch, every movement, every terrified breath became multiplied into dozens, then hundreds of distorted faces staring back. Elias watched through a hidden slit, not for cries of pain, but for the collapse of identity as the victim began to see themselves as a stranger, then as a swarm of strangers until fear dissolved into confusion. When the acid began to flow, it did so slowly, creeping across the mirrored floor like water spilled in a cathedral. The reflections bent and shimmered as the liquid spread, faces fractured into grotesque shapes as it rose around the body. Elias wrote carefully in his notebook, recording not the sounds, the screams he dismissed as unworthy, but the way the reflections warped, the way the face became unrecognizable in the glass long before flesh began to dissolve. To him, this was proof that the body could be undone first in perception, then in substance. The victim fought, of course, pressing against the mirrored walls, smearing them with desperate hands, but each gesture only created more versions of the same terror. The multiplied faces screamed silently back at themselves, and Elias found this symmetry beautiful. When the liquid reached the chest, the reflections broke apart entirely, as though the person had been swallowed by their own image. Elias noted the moment with the precision of a scientist marking the result of a formula. He believed the experiment revealed a truth, that a person could be destroyed twice, first in the mind, then in the body. When the chamber was drained and the remains disposed of, Elias polished the mirrors until no trace remained. He recorded the distortions he had seen in neat handwriting, diagrams of broken faces filling his pages. To him, the mirror box was not cruelty but ritual, a sacred act of reducing the human form to silence and ash through reflection. Above ground, life at the estate remained unbroken. Elias still wore his white gloves to church, still greeted children with calm patience, still invited neighbors to tea where he spoke of weather and crops. The whispers of the village grew quieter, for no one could carry suspicion against a man so polite, so constant, so generous. Yet beneath their feet, in a coffin of mirrors and copper, the truth gleamed eternal, waiting for the next reflection to be shattered. On the Harland land, small graves began to appear, scattered near hedgerows and the edges of fields where the soil was soft. They were marked not with names, only with stones arranged in silence, as if someone had tried to remember but feared to speak. The villagers saw them and assumed they were the resting places of servants' infants, children who had been born too weak to live. No questions were asked because infant death was common, and grief was easier when it was wrapped in familiarity. Families passed the stones without pause, believing sorrow had simply taken its due. But the truth was far darker, shaped not by fate, but by Elias Harland's deliberate hand. Elias had turned his attention to the idea of inheritance, to the question of what it meant for bloodlines to continue. In his journals, he wrote of heirs not as children, but as burdens of flesh waiting to betray their origin. He believed that purity was not carried forward by birth, but by destruction. To him, unborn heirs did not need to breathe to inherit silence. They could be created symbolically, offered up and undone before they ever came into the world. This logic, cold and meticulous, became the foundation of what he called his rituals of ash. The birds were his chosen stand-ins for children. Sparrows, doves, and sometimes ravens caught in nets near the fields were carried into the hidden chamber. Elias bound them in linen. Their wings pinned tight against their small bodies, the cloth wound so firmly that no beak could tear through. To him, the wrapped forms resembled swaddled infants, faceless and helpless, ready to be claimed by the fire. He laid them out carefully on iron trays, each one positioned as though it were a newborn laid to rest. There was no compassion in the gesture, only precision, only ritual. When the flames took the bound birds, their struggles were muffled beneath the linen. Elias stood beside them with his white gloves folded neatly, eyes fixed not on the fire itself but on the way the cloth darkened and shrank, how the small bodies twisted until they collapsed into charred fragments. He wrote of these moments as purification, as proof that silence could be preserved if birth was undone before it reached the world. He collected the ashes with care, placing them in small copper urns that he later buried beneath those nameless stones on the edge of the estate. To anyone who saw, the graves were of infants lost too soon. To Elias, they were victories, offerings to a legacy that only he could define. Each ritual was catalogued in his journals with exacting detail. He numbered them, noted the species of bird, the weight before binding, the time it took for flames to reduce the body to ash. He described the scent, the sound, the faint echoes that rose in the chamber when the fire consumed the linen. His handwriting was steady, almost elegant, as if he believed that cruelty became sanctified when preserved on paper. In his mind, he was not murdering creatures, but perfecting symbols. The birds were not animals to him, but heirs that had been denied, children erased before their voices could ever disrupt the silence he worshipped. The villagers noticed the growing number of stones, but never pressed for answers. They pitied the servants, assuming their hidden lives were marred by private grief. Some even admired the Harlands for allowing such burials on their land, seeing it as generosity, as charity for the poor who could not afford churchyards. The deception was complete because Elias understood the village's hunger for simple explanations. They would rather believe in quiet tragedy than in ritual destruction. As the rituals multiplied, the land itself began to change. The soil near the stones grew darker, richer, as though the ash had seeped into it. Crops planted nearby grew taller, and villagers spoke of Harlan land as blessed. They did not know that what nourished the soil was the residue of Elias's rituals, the remains of bound lives turned to dust. For Elias, this was the truest proof of his work, that silence could not only be preserved but could be spread, that death could feed life, that his legacy could root itself invisibly beneath the fields. In the evenings after these rituals, Elias still attended church, still offered tea to his neighbors, still bent politely to children who laughed in the lanes. His gloves remained spotless, his voice calm, his eyes kind. No one could see that beneath the polished exterior lay a man who measured life only by the ways it could be undone. The graves stood as silent markers of his obsession, accepted by the village, protected by their own unwillingness to ask. And beneath those stones, in urns of copper hidden in the earth, Elias's heirs remained forever unborn, their silence preserved in ash. Elias Harland's journal shifted in tone as the years pressed forward. The neat sketches of bodies bound in linen and reflections broken in mirrors gave way to diagrams that looked more like equations than drawings. He no longer described his acts as rituals. He called them trials, experiments, proofs. Cruelty itself became mathematics to him, a problem to be solved through precision, repetition, and measurement. He wrote not of suffering but of intervals, not of death, but of collapse. In his mind, the body was an instrument that could be tuned until it broke, and he meant to find the exact notes that played it into silence. He built chambers with his own hands, hidden in the deep cellars where coal once had been stored. The air there was heavy and close, but Elias saw in it a laboratory. He fashioned an iron box lined with valves and pipes, a crude barrel modified into an instrument of calculation. He tested pressure, he tested flow, he tested the ways flesh responded when conditions were shifted without warning. To him, these were not torments, but calibrations. He wanted numbers, and he wanted proof that the body could be charted like the ticking of his grandfather clock. The subject for this work was taken without remark, another servant whose absence could be explained away with rumors of running off. The victim was forced into the iron barrel, the lid bolted shut from above. In the suffocating dark, every sound became amplified, the drip of condensation, the rasp of a terrified breath, the slow clank of pipes being turned. Elias moved between notebooks and valves with steady patience, recording each stage as though he were conducting a formal experiment in a university chamber rather than in the bowels of his own estate. He began with scalding steam, flooding the barrel until it hissed like a kettle. The cries from within struck against the metal walls, sharp at first, then muffled as the heat stripped the voice. Elias pressed his ear to the barrel, not to hear the suffering, but to time the silence between each gasp. He noted the minutes until the voice faltered, the seconds between bursts of breath, and wrote these in the margins of his journal with equations that linked temperature to duration. To him, the victim was not human, but data, each tremor and cough a line to be measured against his theory of unmaking. Without pause, he released the steam and forced icy brine through the pipes. The sudden drop in temperature made the iron groan as the body within convulsed violently. Elias marked the contrast carefully, describing how the flesh must feel its own confusion, pulled between burning and freezing until the senses ceased to know the difference. He timed the spasms, wrote down the intervals between each strike against the barrel wall, and treated them as though they were notes in a symphony he alone could hear. The suffering was never the focus, the numbers were. The collapse had to be exact, predictable, repeatable. For hours he alternated the conditions, scalding steam followed by freezing brine, the sequence repeated until the body's responses weakened. Each stage was logged, each reaction measured. Elias believed he was approaching something profound, the mathematics of surrender. He wrote of thresholds, of how a body could resist only so much before silence became the only possible outcome. To him, silence was not defeat but the final equation balanced. The iron barrel was no longer just a container. It was a blackboard on which he wrote his lessons, the human form reduced to proof of a formula. When the subject finally ceased to move, Elias recorded the exact moment, aligning it against temperature, pressure, and time. He did not see the body as dead. He saw it as completed. The barrel was drained, the remnants disposed of, and the chamber cleaned with the care of a surgeon preparing for the next trial. He filed the results into his journals, his handwriting steady, his conclusions written in terms of mathematics rather than morality. He believed he had uncovered laws as true as gravity. That silence could be engineered, that collapse could be charted, that death was not random but a system waiting to be understood. Above ground, the Harland estate remained orderly. Elias wore his gloves, bowed his head in prayer, and greeted neighbors with kindness. No one could imagine that beneath their feet, within an iron barrel, he had begun to write a new science, one that did not seek to save life but to dismantle it piece by piece, until nothing remained but silence measured and recorded. Elias Harland's life shifted when he married Margaret Whitcomb, the daughter of a respectable family who valued gentleness and civility above all else. Margaret saw in Elias nothing but refinement. He carried himself with quiet dignity, his gloves always spotless, his words always measured. Where others found him reserved, she mistook restraint for depth. To her, his silence was a sign of thoughtfulness, his stillness a mark of discipline. She believed she had married a man of rare integrity, one whose calm presence promised safety. In truth, she had stepped into the center of a carefully crafted disguise. The Harland estate became a stage for Elias's performance of respectability. Dinners were hosted with flawless order. Elias presided with calm grace, pouring wine, carving meat, and speaking on matters of science and literature. He was admired for his knowledge, though no one asked how he had come to know so much about anatomy or physics. He quoted scholars, praised discovery, and carried conversations in a way that seemed to lift the mood of every guest. Neighbors left those evenings convinced they had sat in the company of a man of rare intellect and charm. Margaret basked in the admiration, never doubting the sincerity of her husband's carefully practiced smile. Beneath the surface of their home, however, Elias continued his true work. In the dead of night, when Margaret lay in their bed believing her husband was simply pacing out of sleeplessness, he moved through the hidden passages and cellars. He returned quietly before dawn, his gloves wiped clean, his clothing pressed back into order. What Margaret never saw were the compartments beneath their bedroom floor, narrow spaces hidden between the beams, where Elias stored the fragments of his experiments. Bones, stripped and bleached, were arranged with meticulous care. He sorted them by size, from the smallest finger joints to the long femurs, as if the act of classification gave his work permanence. The bones were not kept for sentiment but for study, reminders of what he called completed proofs. Each creak she heard in the night was the sound of her husband cataloging silence. Margaret never asked questions. When boards shifted underfoot, she assumed it was the old estate settling. When faint odors drifted through the floor, she convinced herself they came from damp coal cellars. She had been raised to believe that questioning a man's habits was a sign of mistrust, and so she did not allow herself to wonder. Her trust became Elias's shield, protecting his secrecy as surely as his gloves hid the marks on his hands. To the village, Elias became the model of a polite neighbor. He gave donations for harvest festivals, attended weddings with a modest smile, and stood in the front pew of the church as though devotion flowed through him. When men spoke of industry, he discussed coal markets with reasoned calm. When women spoke of family, he offered sympathy that sounded genuine. He knew what each listener wished to hear, and he gave it freely. No one saw the calculations behind his eyes, the way he measured each word against its effect, the way he polished his kindness like a tool. In the daylight, Margaret believed herself cherished. Elias offered her compliments when others were present, touched her hand with the right degree of warmth, and spoke of their future with assurance. She did not know that in his journals she was not written of as a wife, but as a component of his cover, a figure necessary for the role he played. Her innocence was not protection, but camouflage, making him appear even less threatening to those who might otherwise suspect. At night, the estate became two houses at once. Above, Margaret dreamed in a bed of carved oak, believing in the comfort of marriage. Below, Elias catalogued remains, the fragments of lives he had reduced to ash and silence. His obsession was preserved in neat rows of bones hidden beneath the very floor where his wife slept. The creaks she heard as she stirred in the dark were not the shifting of timber, but the quiet work of a man arranging his trophies by size. And still, in the morning, Elias emerged with a soft smile, offering her tea, speaking of weather and scripture, his gloves unblemished, his voice calm. Margaret saw refinement. The village saw respectability. But the truth lay in the hidden compartments where silence had been given shape, bone by bone, beneath their feet. One wing of the Harland estate was shuttered, its windows closed, its doors barred with locks that no servant was permitted to touch. Dust gathered on its outer halls, and visitors assumed the rooms had simply fallen into disuse, a remnant of older times when the family had been larger. Margaret accepted this too, believing her husband wished for privacy or perhaps a study where he could collect his thoughts. She never pressed, never asked why sounds of scraping, hammering, and muffled clinks of glass drifted faintly from behind the boarded doors at night. What was hidden in that wing was not neglect, but creation. Elias Harland had built his shrine. Inside, he constructed what he called the lantern room. It began with one glass lantern, hand-blown and delicate, placed at the center of a narrow chamber whose walls he painted black so that the light within would never escape. But one lantern became two, then a dozen, then rows of dozens until the chamber glowed with a trembling light that could not be seen from outside. Each lantern was filled not with ordinary oil, but with a mixture he prepared himself, a substance drawn from the rendered fat of those he had already silenced. He refined it with chemicals until it burned steady, unearths, its flame clear and strong, its glow unnervingly warm. The process of rendering was carried out with the same calm precision he gave to all his work. He treated bodies not as lives ended, but as resources. Each one was stripped of its final use, its flesh reduced in cauldrons to liquid fuel. He wrote in his journals of ancestral warmth, believing that by feeding his lanterns with the remnants of his victims, he was not extinguishing them but carrying them forward, transforming silence into light. To him, these flames were not symbols of death, but proof of preservation, proof that he had created something eternal from the bodies that others would have let rot in the soil. When Elias entered the lantern room, he did so with reverence, like a priest stepping into a holy space. He sat at the center of the chamber, surrounded by hundreds of flickering lights. Their flames shivered across the mirrored glass, casting distorted shapes on the black walls, so that it seemed as though the room itself was alive with movement. He closed his eyes and listened to the soft hiss of burning oil, a sound he convinced himself was the breath of those he had reduced to fuel. He told himself they spoke to him in the language of fire, that they were not gone but transfigured, that the silence he had forced upon them had now been given new form. The glow seeped into him, and he described in his notebooks the way it calmed his nerves, the way it filled his chest with steadiness. He believed the flames held memory, that when he gazed into them he could see the shapes of the lives he had unmade flickering just beneath the glass. The lantern room became his sanctuary, a place where his crimes were no longer crimes but rituals, transformed into something that felt sacred. Each visit was recorded as if it were a mass. The hours he sat within marked down, the order of lanterns noted, the strength of each flame observed. He polished the glass daily, keeping every vessel spotless, believing that cleanliness preserved the dignity of the shrine. Margaret knew only that a part of her home was forbidden, and she obeyed. Guests asked politely why the wing was closed, and Elias answered with a smile that it was under repair or used for storage. None questioned further. The Harlands had given so much to the village that no one wished to pry. Respect once again became silence, and silence gave Elias freedom to continue his work. The villagers saw only a refined man with gentle manners, never imagining that behind locked doors he sat surrounded by light born from the flesh of those who had disappeared among them. The lantern room grew until it consumed the entire wing. Servants whispered of strange warmth seeping through the walls at night, of faint glows that seemed to breathe beneath the cracks, but they dared not speak aloud of what they feared. To them, their wages were survival, and suspicion was too costly. And so Elias was left alone in his chamber, watching his lanterns flicker, convinced he had built a cathedral of silence, a monument where the living and the dead were joined through fire. In his mind, this was not cruelty but legacy. The lanterns would outlast him. The flames, fueled by those he had claimed, would continue long after his own body had failed. He believed he had created a form of immortality, not for them but for himself, for his name, for his silence. And as he sat in the trembling glow, his white gloves folded in his lap, he whispered words that only the flames could hear. Words of devotion to the ancestral warmth he alone understood. Margaret gave birth to 2 children within the quiet walls of the Harland estate. Daniel came first, his cries sharp against the hush of the house, and then Clara, softer, more delicate, her voice barely more than a whisper from the beginning. To the village, their arrival was celebrated as proof that the Harland line would continue. Neighbors brought gifts of bread and fruit, offering blessings for the children's future. They saw only health, wealth, and refinement. They did not see the shadows that waited to shape these children. Shadows that belonged not to fate but to Elias Harland. From the earliest days, Elias was deliberate in their upbringing. He did not raise his voice, nor did he show affection with warmth. Instead, he instilled in them discipline so strict it felt like another language. They were taught how to walk without sound, how to close doors without a click, how to bow their heads in church with eyes lowered and voices muted. He corrected them with a look rather than a word, and soon they learned to anticipate his expectations before he spoke. Margaret, eager to see her children as models of refinement, praised their quiet obedience, never realizing it was not respect but submission being shaped. There was one rule Elias repeated more than any other, a law that hovered over every part of their lives. Never speak of what the house holds. The children were told from infancy that the estate itself carried secrets, that to break silence was to betray the family. Elias wrapped this command in the guise of honor, telling them that Harlands had always preserved dignity through restraint. But what he meant was something far darker. He meant the locked rooms, the barred wing, the strange smells of ash and oil, the muffled noises that sometimes rose from beneath the floor. These things were never to be named, never to be spoken of, not to anyone inside or outside the house. Silence was their inheritance, more binding than blood. Daniel grew into this rule with stiff poise. He carried himself like his father, shoulders straight, jaw tight, always watching before he acted. Clara, more sensitive, trembled when she heard noises at night. The faint scrape of something shifting in the walls, the low hum of lanterns burning where they should not. She wanted to ask, but her father's eyes silenced her. Even as a child, she felt the weight of his command pressing on her chest. The children learned that to remain quiet was not only to obey, but to survive. At night, when the house creaked and groaned, when half-heard cries seemed to bleed through the beams, Daniel and Clara pressed their heads beneath their pillows, trying not to listen. Sometimes they thought they heard whispers drifting from behind locked doors, words that sounded like prayers or pleas, but they convinced themselves they were dreams. They told themselves it was the wind, or the settling of stone, or the memory of voices they had imagined. They learned to carry these doubts in silence, never speaking even to each other of what they feared. Their shared ignorance became a bond, enforced not by choice but by necessity. Elias cultivated this enforced blindness with care. He praised their composure in public, showing them off as children of rare discipline, polite beyond their years. Villagers admired their manners, saying Margaret and Elias had raised them well. But behind that admiration lay the truth. The children had been conditioned to hide what they knew, to carry the weight of their father's legacy without question. They became accomplices not through action but through silence, their lives twisted into extensions of his will. In the locked compartments beneath the floor and the glowing lanterns hidden in the shuttered wing, Elias continued his rituals. Daniel and Clara never saw them, not fully, but they lived in their shadow every day. The faint smells, the muffled sounds, the strange rules that governed their home, all of it seeped into their bones. They did not need to witness to be shaped. They were raised inside a cage of unspoken truths, and the bars of that cage were built from fear and obedience. By the time they were old enough to understand the weight of words, they no longer believed they had the right to speak them. Silence had become second nature, as natural as breath. They did not resist it because they had been told from birth that it was the Harlan way. And so Daniel and Clara grew, refined and restrained, carrying with them the inheritance their father had demanded, a life shaped not by what they saw or heard, but by what they were forbidden to name. The Harland estate became the stage for a new performance of Elias's invention, a ritual he presented to the world as an act of generosity. He called it remembrance, a gesture of piety toward the miners who had given their lives in the black pits that fed the Harland fortune. Each year, at the turning of spring, Elias invited the villagers to gather on his land, where he would set alight great pyres of ash. Families came in solemn silence, believing it to be a memorial, a chance to honor fathers, brothers and sons who had been lost to collapse, to sickness, to fire. They saw Elias as a benefactor who gave them a place to mourn, and their gratitude deepened the loyalty that had bound them to his name for generations. But the truth was hidden within the flames. Elias fed the pyres not only with wood and coal, but with the remnants of his victims blended carefully so that no eye could distinguish bone from cinder. The bodies he had reduced in his chambers, stripped of voice and shape, found their final place in the towering fires. To the villagers, the smoke that drifted skyward was a prayer. To Elias, it was a transfiguration. He believed he was scattering silence into the air, mingling it with the breath of the living so that all who inhaled it would carry his legacy unknowingly within their lungs. The fires grew larger each year, and with them Elias's confidence. He spoke to the crowd with the calm voice of a man of faith, offering words about sacrifice and memory, reminding them that life was fragile and that silence was the truest form of respect. His words moved them, for they longed to believe their grief was given dignity. They never saw how carefully he timed each phrase, how he studied their faces as though they were experiments of their own, how he measured the weight of their sorrow against the rhythm of the flames. Children played at the edges of the gatherings, tossing pebbles into the ash when the fires cooled, never knowing that the dust clinging to their hands had once been human flesh. Farmers carried handfuls of the gray powder back to their fields, spreading it in the soil with thanks to Elias for allowing them to share in the harvest of remembrance. When the crops grew tall and green, they spoke of blessings, never suspecting that the land had been seeded with something more terrible than memory. Elias watched with satisfaction, believing he had succeeded in binding his victims into the very earth of the estate, turning their silence into nourishment, their destruction into growth. He wrote in his journals that the fields themselves were now his accomplices, that every stalk of wheat and every ear of corn carried his inheritance forward. Margaret stood at his side during these festivals, her eyes lowered, her hands folded. She believed her husband's words as deeply as the villagers did, never questioning what he burned upon the pyres. Daniel and Clara, trained from infancy to accept silence, watched without expression. They had learned not to ask, not to wonder why their father's gaze lingered on the smoke longer than any prayer required. In their hearts, unease twisted, but obedience kept it bound. They were children being raised not by love but by ritual, children who knew that to doubt their father was to break the only law that mattered. The villagers praised Elias for his devotion, and each year they came in greater numbers. The fires became tradition, a fixture of the community so deeply woven into their lives that no one dared to think of the man behind it as anything but holy. The Harlands had bought silence with coal and charity, and now Elias cemented it with fire. His reputation grew untouchable precisely because he had learned how to clothe his cruelty in the garments of honor. At night, when the embers smoldered and the crowd had gone home, Elias walked the fields alone, scattering the last of the ash with his gloved hands. He whispered to the soil, convinced that the earth itself was listening, that it welcomed the remains of those he had claimed. He wrote afterward that he felt surrounded by ancestral warmth, that the land now pulsed with voices too quiet for any but him to hear. He believed the fires had sanctified his work, transforming murder into legacy, turning his rituals into something eternal. The villagers slept peacefully after these festivals, comforted by the thought that their dead had been honored. But the truth was far more haunting. They had breathed the smoke of Elias's cruelty, eaten the crops fed by his victims, carried his silence into their own bodies without ever knowing. And as the festivals became tradition, As children grew up never questioning the gray dust on their fields, Elias's inheritance spread beyond his family. It passed into the community itself, binding them to his legacy not by choice but by the quiet complicity of ignorance. Margaret Harland had lived for years in obedience to her husband's silences. She accepted the locked doors, the shuttered wing, the creaks at night that Elias explained with a gentle smile or ignored altogether. She had never touched the places he forbade, never opened the drawers where he kept his journals, never strayed into the cellar when he vanished for hours at a time. But silence, even when practiced faithfully, has its limits. One winter afternoon, while Elias was away speaking with the parish, Margaret followed a sound in their bedroom, the hollow shift of a board beneath the carpet. When she lifted it, her life was split in two. Beneath the floor rested a trunk, small but heavy, its iron clasp stiff with disuse. She forced it open, expecting perhaps old books or forgotten clothing. Instead, she uncovered objects that stripped away every illusion she had lived by. Inside lay coils of fine threads, stiffened with what she realized was dried blood, strands once forced through living tongues. She found sketches of long boxes drawn with obsessive precision, their mirrored walls shaded to suggest reflections of countless faces. She found small fragments of bone, arranged in velvet-lined compartments, each piece labeled by size and shape as though part of a collection. These were not keepsakes but trophies, artifacts of cruelty hidden in plain darkness beneath the bed where she slept. Margaret recoiled, her breath caught between disbelief and terror. For years she had called her husband refined, patient, disciplined. She had praised him before others, defended his coldness as dignity, admired his composure as strength. But here was the truth she had never allowed herself to imagine. Elias was not a man of honor, but a man who harvested silence, who catalogued horror with the same care others gave to scripture. The refinement she had mistaken for virtue was nothing more than disguise. She closed the trunk with trembling hands, but she could not unsee what she had seen. When Elias returned, she could not meet his gaze with the same innocence. He noticed, of course. He always noticed. His calm voice asked nothing, but his eyes searched her face, reading the tremor in her movements. Margaret did not confront him with words. She had no words strong enough. Her silence betrayed her, and Elias understood. He did not raise his voice, nor strike her, nor curse. He simply placed a hand on her arm, steady and cold, and guided her away from the bedroom with the ease of a man leading a guest to dinner. He led her through the halls she had walked countless times, past the portraits of ancestors that seemed to watch her with new malice, down toward the shuttered wing she had never dared enter. The locks opened beneath his hand, and the lantern room breathed its heat into the corridor. Margaret staggered as she stepped inside, her eyes meeting the glow of countless glass vessels filled with the flames of rendered bodies. The air was thick with a sweetness that turned her stomach, and the flickering light revealed shapes upon the walls that shifted like ghosts. She understood then. What her husband had built, a cathedral of death disguised as devotion. Elias stood at her side with perfect composure. He spoke softly of ancestral warmth, of legacy, of the silence that had been preserved in the flames. His words were measured, calm, almost tender, but they only deepened her horror. Margaret pressed her hands to her mouth to keep from crying out, for she understood what her husband required of her now. She was no longer a wife. She was a witness, and witnesses could not be allowed to remain free. When he turned to leave, he did so with no anger. He stepped into the hall and closed the heavy door behind him, sliding the lock into place with the same composure he used when shutting a book. Margaret was left inside the lantern room, surrounded by flames that hissed softly as though whispering her fate. She pressed her palms to the door, but the heat behind her warned her that to scream was to break the only law that bound her family. She remained silent as Elias had always demanded. To the village, Elias explained her absence with ease. Margaret had taken ill, he told them, a fever that kept her bedridden, too weak to appear. Neighbors nodded, offered prayers, and trusted his word. He stood in church with bowed head, his gloves immaculate, his voice calm, while his wife languished behind locked doors, sealed within a chamber that burned with the remains of his victims. The Harland name remained untarnished in the eyes of the world. Only Margaret knew the truth, and she now carried it alone in a room where silence was worshipped and light was nothing but the echo of ash. By the time Margaret's absence had become an accepted truth among the villagers, whispers had already begun to circulate about others who had vanished near the Harland estate. A laborer hired for seasonal work failed to return home. A young woman passing through the village was last seen near the edge of the Harland fields. A beggar who had sought bread at the estate gate was never seen again. Each disappearance on its own might have been forgotten, explained away by poverty, wandering, or misfortune. But together they began to form a pattern, and the pattern pointed toward the Harland land. The villagers spoke cautiously, never directly accusing Elias, but suspicion grew in the shadows of their conversations. They noticed the closed wing of the estate, the shuttered windows, the faint smoke that sometimes rose from chimneys long after midnight. They remembered the maid who had vanished years earlier, and though their loyalty to the family was deep, loyalty began to bend under the weight of fear. Even silence has limits, and the estate's silence was too heavy, too constant to remain unquestioned forever. Authorities were called to search, though they came hesitantly, knowing the Harlands still held power and influence. Men walked the fields with lanterns, dogs sniffed the hedgerows, and officials questioned the servants who kept their eyes lowered and their words clipped short. Elias met them with calm composure, guiding them through the visible parts of his estate, opening doors that led only to order and refinement. He spoke gently of the tragedies of the poor, the misfortunes of wanderers, the instability of mining families. He even offered to contribute funds to aid the search. To the untrained eye, Elias appeared as a grieving benefactor rather than a man under suspicion. What the searchers never found were the hidden wells deep beneath the estate, sealed and masked by stone. For years, Elias had reduced bodies to ash in his chambers, scattering remnants into fields and fires. But when remains were too many or ash too much, he lowered them into the wells, dropping them into depths that no lantern light could reach. There, sealed away, the bodies were erased by time and water, leaving nothing that could ever testify against him. The estate itself had become his accomplice, its underground veins swallowing evidence as easily as it swallowed coal. Yet the land began to betray him in ways he had not planned. The mines beneath the estate, hollowed and unstable, flooded after heavy rains. The tunnels groaned and collapsed, swallowing paths and chambers that Elias himself had built. Some said it was natural decay, the fate of all mines abandoned too long. Others whispered it was punishment, the earth itself rebelling against what had been buried in its depths. Fields cracked, wells overflowed, and the Harland estate began to sag upon its own foundation. The villagers looked upon the crumbling land and said the family's silence had finally grown too heavy, pressing the house down into the soil that had fed it. As suspicion grew, the Harland name withered. Where once neighbors spoke of refinement and generosity, now they muttered of curses, of secrets too dark to voice. The family's wealth could not erase the unease. Servants fled, unwilling to remain in rooms that creaked with unseen weight. The children, Daniel and Clara, grew pale and withdrawn, their eyes always lowered, their voices barely more than whispers. Margaret was never seen again, and her absence became another stone on the pile of suspicion that threatened to bury the Harlands. When authorities returned with greater force, Elias was gone. He vanished as though the earth itself had swallowed him, leaving behind his estate, his children, and his endless journals of silence. Some claimed he fled abroad, carrying his secrets with him. Others believed he had descended into the flooded tunnels, choosing to disappear into the very darkness that had always sustained him. The truth was never confirmed. What remained was absence, the most fitting legacy of a man who had worshipped silence above all else. The house stood in decay, its shutters closed, its rooms emptied of servants and guests. The villagers avoided it, saying the walls held whispers, that the ground itself remembered what had been buried there. The Harland name, once spoken with respect, became a curse, a warning. And though Elias left no body to be tried, no confession to be read, his work lingered in the soil, in the fields, in the air that had once carried the smoke of his fires. His absence was not an end, but a continuation of the silence he had built. Silence that outlasted the house itself. Generations after the Harland estate had rotted into ruin, children playing among its crumbling stones uncovered fragments of leather-bound journals buried in the earth. The pages were damp, but the ink remained, lines of careful handwriting preserved like scripture. What they contained horrified even hardened scholars. Diagrams of the body written like hymns, instructions for silence described as though they were prayers. The methods were not crude ramblings, but orderly, ritualistic, recorded with a reverence that suggested Elias Harland had believed himself a priest of unmaking. Each page was a window into a mind that had turned cruelty into liturgy. The discovery forced the village to confront what had been whispered but never spoken aloud. A memorial was raised on the Harland fields, built of stone and layered with ash, a silent marker for the nameless and the uncounted. Laws followed, demanding stricter oversight of private estates, protections for servants, and inquiries into the hidden chambers of the wealthy. Yet the questions never ceased. How many had vanished without record? How many other houses hid sealed rooms where silence had been perfected? Evil, they concluded, rarely announces itself. It does not wear horns. It wears gloves, smiles softly, and pours tea with gentle hands.